G'day, folks. It's Rod here from Paint with Rod, and of course, more art in the Learn to Paint Academy. And just got a little video for you here. We recently did a painting challenge, a live painting challenge, and it was called the Palette Knife and Reflections. So I've made a little time lapse here of just what we covered, talking about the brushes and the palette knives. So this particular painting challenge was all about palette knives and doing a much larger painting. So this is me talking about the background, the setup, and so on. And I didn't really use a photo reference. I had this idea to do a waterfall in a gorge, like in outback Australia. And so I just did a rough pencil sketch, and then I decided I was going to, use my imagination and my intuition to tell me how this painting should unfold. So this is more of an advanced painting. We will be getting back to some beginner basic style painting in the Learn to Paint Academy soon, but this is more one we've done for our more advanced students. And it was an opportunity for me just to really practice and develop my palette knife techniques further. So what I've just done there, that's step one of what we call the Moore method. That was a kind of idea I was using, right? It was a photo that I took in the outback. That's step one, is to draw in the big shapes into your painting. Now, this is more advanced painting, so there's more big shapes. I think it's a 1.2 meter by 900 mil board. And now I'm going into step two. Actually, this is step three of our 5-step process. I'm blocking in my darks. Okay, so I always start off doing my darks. I start with the darkest darks in the foreground, and I work to the distance. And by doing that, you set up a values scale. And as things move backwards, I'm cooling it off, right? Making the temperature cooler and the value lighter. You can see me doing that in the mix there on the screen as things get further away. Now I'm doing all the verticals, right? So I'm doing all the trees, everything that stands upright. If you've ever read Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, he talks there about the 4 different planes of landscape, and the verticals, they're the darkest part of a painting, right? So we start off with our verticals and we work from the foreground to the distance. And we go dark to light. And as we progress the darks into the distance, we get cooler and lighter, okay? So now I'm going to an earth tone. I'm going to block in this rock face, this wall. And, I'm using a big fan brush. I'm doing this really rough because I like to start out very, very loose with my painting and then start to progressively tighten up parts of the painting, not all of it. I like to leave parts of my painting a bit loose and bit carefree, and then around my focal area I'll start to pull it together and tighten it all up. So I've just mixed up yellow ochre and alizarin crimson, bit of cobalt blue in there to get that earthy brown tone. Pretty easy mix. And when I'm starting out in this early stage, I've got these rocks in the foreground, so they're darker than the rocks at the back, but they're also they're going to obviously big highlights and stuff over these rocks as we progress. At this point, I'm painting really thin. Right? I'm using lots and lots of thinner. I'm using a fast drying thinner because I'm using oils, right? Now, if I was using acrylics, exactly the same process. There's no difference for me with acrylics to oils. Some people are concerned that there might be a difference, but with me, there's, I use exactly the same process. So I start out really thin. If I was using acrylics, I'd still be painting it quite thin. I'd just be thinning the paint down with a bit of water at this stage, rather than using a solvent, right? So I'm putting reflections in there, and I'm keeping it really loose and the paint really thin because I don't want to be committed too much at this point. I don't want to be locked into having to do the painting a certain way because I've spent a lot of time developing an area, right? So this is a real loose, fast. I mean, obviously it's on time lapse or sped up, but I was still painting pretty fast. And that was the end of the first session, right? So this was run as a 4-day challenge. So I left it overnight. We come back the next day, and then I come back and I start, okay, let's start to develop these areas because I did paint pretty thin. Let me reestablish some darks here, okay? So my darkest darks in the foreground, and these little shrubs on the rocks here. So I need to make them, I'm now starting to think a little bit more about getting the shape right, okay, and putting these feel of trees and shrubs, and you've got to get the outline shape of them right. That's the first thing, right? If you're going to make them look like trees, then they've got to look like the silhouette of them has to be looking like trees. That's step one, right? We're getting the elements right. And if you want, I'll do a video on how to paint different elements, whether that's rocks or clouds or trees, that you'd find in a painting, in a landscape. If you want me to do a video on that, just leave a comment. And by the way, while you're watching this, please like this video and subscribe and share it. Helps us out. Now, see how I'm building up the tree shapes here, but these trees are slightly further back than the other trees. So I've gone a little bit cooler. I've added more blue into the mix. It's still a dark, right? It's just a little bit lighter and it's a little bit cooler. So as I move back, and this is the secret to getting aerial perspective, and I'm no master at it by any stretch, I'm still learning myself. But as things move back, we're going to lighten it off with white, and we're lightening the value with white, and we're cooling the temperature by adding more blue, okay? And so I'm just really re-establishing everything. And then we'll move into a phase where I then start what I call the modeling phase, where we'll start to take each of the main elements and build them up and getting mid-tones into them and getting, lighter tones into them. Because all I'm doing right now is the darkest tones in each of these elements, okay? So during my block-in, the block-in for me, and I know every artist is different, but the method I teach it in the Learn to Paint Academy and with More Art, the method I teach there is we block in our darks, right? We block in our big mass shapes and we get the darks in, and then we also get the temperature right. So it's about values and temperature at this point. Well, actually, it's about composition, shape, then values and temperature, right? Just putting a little sandy embankment there, people to come and stand on before they dive in for a swim. And that bit I'm just doing there, that's going to be the waterfall. So I'm putting a light bluey gray there as a backdrop in there. And I'm playing around with the idea, am I going to have reflections of the waterfall or not? I haven't decided yet, right? So build up some reflections of these rocks. And I'll let you in on a little secret, right? A lot of what I'm doing at this stage, I haven't got it right. I very rarely, I don't know, I'm just one of those painters who I start out really fast and fairly gregarious and, out of control. And then I have to try and pull it together towards the end. That's just my nature, right? It's just my personality, a little bit reckless and loose, right? So that's how I start out. And then I have to start to tighten the painting up. But what that means is, and I'm not suggesting you necessarily do like that, we all have to find our own approach, right? But what that means is often I'll have my values will be way out, or my temperature will be out, or the shapes will be wrong, right? And I have to fix that. So now you can see here I've mixed this mid-value green. I'm going to start building up the elements. And the elements here are these foreground trees and shrubs, right? So to make an element look three-dimensional, we need a dark, we need a mid-tone, and we need a light. And so I'm building up the mid-tones here. And as soon as I put those on, you can see the form of these trees and shrubs now starting to develop, okay? So I'm just mixing up a green. It's just blues and yellows and reds, right? Everything comes from the three primary colors. So my palette is actually based around the three primary colors, right? And I'm using my big brush. This is my, I developed a brush set for our students and myself. They're long-handled. They're a synthetic bristle hair, so they perform like hog hair brushes. I'm using, one of those. It's a big 1-inch flat brush with a long handle. I like the long handle because then I can hold it at the back of the brush and, lose a little bit of control, and I get a little bit of that loose feeling in there rather than painting everything tight and rigid. So now I'm putting this mid value on these trees that are a bit further away. So I've lightened the mix off slightly. And I've just made it ever so slightly cooler, a bit more blue in the mix, right? So I've moved the green to be more of a bluey green as I go back, cooler, right? So our blues are our cooler temperatures. and our reds, yellows, and oranges are our warmer temperatures, right? Well, just think about it. If you get the color wheel and have a look, you can split the color wheel in half. One side's fire, reds, yellows, and oranges, and the other side is ice, blues, right? So that's how we understand our temperature, okay? So you can see I'm mixing up blue and white, probably cobalt blue. And now I have to say, because this is a really large painting for me, my studio lights are quite close, and it's washing out that top quarter of the board there, right? So I apologize for that. It is difficult to see that top part, but I'm using that blue and white mix that you can see on the palette there, and a little bit of yellow ochre in it. And that was the end of that session, right? So now we come back, it's a new day. Actually, I'd left a few days, so you can see I put down some medium there, which is a oil-based medium, right? Because this has started to dry off, I put down some oil-based medium, and now we can get into the palette knife. See there, I've got a light mix of yellow ochre and white and a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I'm trying to capture where the sun's clipping on the rock faces up there. However, remember I said before, I haven't necessarily got everything right. So what I come to realize after spending some time doing this is that I haven't got the values and the setting right. I may have to go back and correct it. You can see here as these rocks come forward now, I'm using the palette knife. I've got a warmer mix. There's more red in there, a bit of cadmium red and yellow ochre, a little bit of blue. You know, I always put a little pinhead of the third primary in there just to desaturate it a little bit. I've mixed up an earthy brown. Now, a brown is just orange with a bit of blue in it, right? So I'm basically using the same 3 primaries for every mix. I've just got 2 of each primary, right? I've got 2 blues, 2 reds, 2 yellows, and I do have a couple of booster colors. I've got Viridian and I've got Burnt Sienna. I don't really use them that much though. Now you can see over on the left-hand side of that rock section there, around this rock pool, I've gone darker and I've left it in shadow, right? That's important. You don't want everything to be in light. And so now I'm building the shadows back up into these trees, trying to get the shapes right and getting the right balance between the shadow and the light. And what I've come to realize, 15 years of painting and most of that time teaching beginners to intermediate level artists, you know, I've probably done over 1,000 paintings, and I've come to realize that painting, to get some level of representational painting, it's all about pushing lights against darks and then back and forward between that and getting the right combination of that, right? And in the process of that, getting the shapes to be in the right shape and in the right place. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's fundamentally, I think, what we do as artists, painters. If you're a painter, our job is to push paint around, but we don't want to do that randomly, right? You can see they're adding a little bit more yellow ochre into this mix now. It's warmer. It's got more of a feel of light capturing on the trees here. The light's coming from the right-hand side. So you don't want to randomly just push paint around. You need to have knowledge and understanding of the principles of painting, you know, the basics, the fundamentals. You need to understand that, because then you start pushing paint around the surface with intentionality, right? Prior to that, you're just doing it randomly and hoping for the best and getting frustrated, right? Once you have a solid understanding of how to create form, how to make marks, how to paint in a painterly way, if that's what you want, a loose impressionistic way. Once you've got a solid understanding of that, then our job is to push paint around the surface within the construct of our composition, our idea for the composition, and push darks against light and then lights against dark, right? And if you do that successfully, you end up with a nice painting. If you don't do that successfully, then we try again, right? We put it down to experience and we try again. Now you can see here that my original blocking of this wall face was a little bit light. So now I'm trying to find the right color and the right value, right? And you'll see me struggle here. I had a lot of trouble. In fact, I was struggling in my mind at this point. I was thinking, oh, this is going terribly bad. I might cancel and not do the painting challenge, right? Because I pre-film all this, right? And then, I do the voiceover while the live challenge is running. And at this point, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to have to cancel the painting challenge because this is just not working at all, right? So I was getting a little bit concerned at this point that this painting wasn't going to work. And there's a few things that are fundamentally wrong, which I'll talk you through in a moment, and you'll see me make the corrections for them. And once I fix those up, you can see now I know I've made an error. I'm wiping it all out with paper towel. Right? This is the beauty of oil paint. If it's not working, scrape it off or wipe it off, right? And don't be afraid to do that. For years, I was terrified of the idea of wiping it off, right? And then once I started doing that, it liberated me, right? I'm just trying to adjust the tone because these trees in the background don't quite look right. There's something wrong and it's bugging me. I mean, and I'm just trying to find a solution here at the moment. Okay. And in reality, what it was is I pushed those trees too far back and I need to bring them forward more, which you'll see me do. Okay. So this was a frustrating session for me whilst I was painting it, right? Once I'd finished painting it, the whole painting, not just this session, it all fell into place, and I was like, okay, I understand exactly where my problems were there, right? So now I'm putting some lighter tone on these trees. So you need dark and mid and a light tone. You can get away with just a dark and a light, but often we need the three tones here to make the feeling of form, right? Three-dimensionality, because I always say this, but we have to remember we're trying to capture a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface. So we need to understand how to create that illusion. It's an illusion that we create, right? Now I've gone for really warm greens in the foreground here. Okay, so we want warm temperatures in the foreground and cooler as we go back in the distance. There's only a couple of things to remember about aerial perspective, right? Dark in the foreground and lighter as we transition to the background, and temperature warmer in the foreground and cooler in the background. Now there are other things, but those two things will do all the heavy lifting, right? I'm just putting in some brown rock tones into the rocks in there. And I'm doing it very randomly. I'm using the palette knife, very loose marks. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy using the palette knife. As you can probably see. Okay, a little bit of light on those rock faces. And, I'm trying to avoid things like hard edges because unless it's the top of a rock face or something, I try and avoid the hard edges. So I soften those out. So that was into the third session. Now we're into, I think, the fourth session here, right? I've got to try and pull it together. I've got all these people watching and I know it's not working. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and pull that row of trees that I'm working on there. I'm going to try and pull them forward by darkening everything. Okay, because the jump backwards is too much, right? So once I sort of had time to reflect on this painting and I understood that, then okay, let's get to work. Let's darken the darks and also darken the midtones and the highlights a little bit. Okay, and that'll pull them closer to us. We'll have less contrast with the other trees, and it'll also give us more room to work on the rock face of the gorge here. So you can see now I've made the decision to change the shadow tone. Right, I've mixed up a purple, cobalt blue, and alizarin crimson, and I'm putting it on pretty thin. So some of that red that I had there previously, that orange, is still coming through that mix, right? So I'm using the paint pretty thin and I'm allowing the underpaint to come through because I believe that nothing in painting should be wasted, even if it's wrong, right? Still let some of it come through and it'll just make your painting far more dynamic and more interesting, building up layers like that, right? So immediately you can see that this changes the dynamic of the painting completely. And as soon as I'd done that, I felt so much better, right? So much relief, because I could see, okay, this works. That shadow tone on the wall there is actually going to work for us. And so now I'm mixing up a mid value, right, which is darker than the highlights I put on there earlier. And it's just, it's a yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. And we'll start working that in with the palette knife and allow the palette knife to create some random type effects. The beauty of the palette knife is to get all these hit and miss type of effects, right? And so I love the palette knife. I was fortunate to have lessons with Brian Cook. He was in his 80s at the time. And, I think I did about half a dozen workshops with him, and learning from him. He was a master of the palette knife. And Brian and I became friends, and I'd asked him to come up to my studio so that I could film him doing some palette knife projects, because here he was with all this knowledge built up over his life, and he was a true master artist. And, he was in his 80s. I said, Brian, if anything happens to you, mate, then all that knowledge is gone, And so I talked to him, and he agreed we'll come up and we'll film some projects. And so over email, back and forward, we you can see there I'm using the big palette knife now and really chunking that paint in, starting to come together, isn't it? Over a few months, we talked back and forward on email, and we developed 4 painting projects, which would have been perfect for people just learning out how to use the palette knife. Unfortunately, he passed away before we could film him. So I filmed the 4 projects on his behalf, and you'll find those in the Learn to Paint Academy if you become a member. Now, I'm just putting in some little branches and twigs and things with a light tone. You don't need much, right? You just need a little hint of them. And I'll use partly a rigger brush, but also you can see I'm using the edge of the palette knife to get them in as well. And don't overdo this. This is one of the mistakes I used to make. I'd put something down like this, and I think to myself, that looks great. So I just keep doing more and more of it, right? And so keep it a little bit understated, right? You can see I'm back to my rigger brush here. Okay, dropping in all these little tree chunks. And, all of a sudden they start to look like trees, don't they? When you just a little hint of information. So you don't need to overly detail any of this. I like to paint loose and impressionistic and a little bit abstract in parts. So my basic approach is to not really detail anything, but to provide enough information for the mind of the observer, the art lover, right, to fill in the details. You see here I'm putting in dark shadows for these rocks, using the big palette knife here. And look, because I've got the big palette knife, I am clipping in over the top of some of the other work I've done, knocking out bits of the tree. It doesn't matter, because that's part of the beauty of the palette knife is you get these real hit and miss effects, right? Putting in a bit of sky, and I'm going to keep it real loose. And little hints of water ripples and so on. Bit more highlight on the waterfall and where the water's splashing over the rocks here. And turned out to be a good project, right? It's now sitting in my gallery, leaning against the wall. I look at it every day, and at some point I might go back in and make some small tweaks. They won't be big adjustments. They'll be small little tweaks here and there. But overall, I was pretty happy with the painting. Going to get into some little bit of the viridian in the foreground here just to punch up the greens in the foreground, but not in the background, right? It looks like there's some bright greens up on the top, but that's just the way the lighting's affecting it. So, yeah, overall, I was pretty happy with the way this project came together. And, it's a big painting. It's probably suited more to somebody who's had a bit of experience with painting, although we had a lot of beginners have a go at it and did some great work. The full course, which is about 5 hours, you'll find that in the Learn to Paint Academy. So if you are a member, it's in the Learn to Paint Academy for you right now. If you're not a member, I'll pop a link for you. Oop, looks like I've shrunk down there. Let me just fix that. I'll pop a link in the description for you if you're not a member of the Learn to Paint Academy. You want to come and check it out. But I hope you learned some things from this video. Probably the big takeaway is, there was a point in that painting about 2/3 of the way through where I thought I'd lost it completely, right? And I was about to give it up. And, I persisted because I was already 3 or 4 hours into filming it. I persisted to try and make it work. And it came together, in the latter stages of the painting. So sometimes it's just like having a look, because between that third session and the fourth session where I pulled it together, there was about maybe 3 or 4 days break. And sometimes you need that little bit of space away from your painting just to look at it with fresh eyes. And as soon as I came back to it 3 or 4 days later and looked at it, I thought, I know what it needs. That's when I darkened that background row of trees and put that purple shadow tone in, and then everything fell into place from there. All right. Fun painting. Great opportunity to use the palette knife. And check it out. Check out the full course in the Learn to Paint Academy. And please like and subscribe to this video if you've enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. That'll encourage me to create more videos like this and other videos in the future. Cheers for now. Happy painting.